The faint smell of pine and coffee always meant Kale was already awake. Ren opened his eyes slowly, blinking at the white ceiling above him. The morning light was coming in thin and pale through the gap in the curtains, the kind of light that existed before the city fully woke up, soft and unhurried, like the world was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. He lay still for a moment, doing the thing he always did first thing in the morning, before his phone and before his schedule and before the noise of everything else. He listened. Cabinet door. Tap running briefly. The specific sound of a spoon being set down on the counter with careful, unhurried precision. Kale. Ren turned his head and found him standing at the window, one hand wrapped around a mug, his dark hair pushed back and messy from sleep, early morning light falling in a pale stripe across one shoulder. He was wearing the old long-sleeved shirt he always slept in, dark gray, worn soft, slightly too big across the shoulders. He was looking at the city below with that particular expression he wore when he was thinking about something he hadn't decided to say yet. Ren watched him for a long moment without speaking. 7 years with this man, and every single morning still felt like something Ren had not fully earned yet, something he was still surprised to wake up inside of. He had written 4 albums worth of songs, hundreds of thousands of words, trying to describe what it was like to be in love with Kale, and every time he came up short. Not because the feeling was too small, because it was too specific, too detailed, too made of ordinary things. The pine smell, the coffee, the worn gray shirt, the morning light on one shoulder. "You're staring again," Kale said, without turning from the window. "I can't help it." Ren sat up, stretching both arms overhead until his back popped in 2 places. "You're in my apartment, standing at my window. What do you want me to do? Sleep like a normal person?" Kale finally turned. There was the small movement at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a wide smile. "It's 6:15. I know what time it is. Do you? I set an alarm for 7. And yet." Ren swung his legs over the edge of the bed. Kale was tall, considerably taller than Ren, with the kind of build that came from years of actual physical work and not from a gym aesthetic. He had serious dark eyes that strangers consistently found intimidating, a jaw that looked like it had been drawn with purpose, and a way of occupying space that was very quiet and very complete. People who met him for the first time often didn't know what to make of him. He didn't perform warmth. He didn't try to put people at ease. But Ren had learned, years ago, that Kale's silence was not distance. It was attention. Kale was the kind of person who noticed everything and said only the things that mattered. When Ren talked too fast and too loud and forgot to breathe, Kale listened. When Ren spiraled in his own head at 2 in the morning about whether his music meant anything, Kale made tea and sat nearby without offering false reassurance. When Ren was performing confidence he didn't have, Kale saw through it every time and said nothing until they were alone. They had met when Ren was 19. Anxious and loud and desperate to prove himself, brand new to a mid-tier entertainment company, still figuring out how to walk in stage clothes without tripping. Kale had been 21 and assigned as one of the junior members of the venue security team for a showcase Ren was performing in. He was quiet and careful and incredibly good at reading rooms, and he said approximately 12 words to Ren in the first 3 months of knowing him. Then one night in November, during a rehearsal for a major showcase that Ren was terrified about, Ren had an anxiety attack in a back stairwell. Full collapse. Hands shaking, vision going dark at the edges, unable to get enough air to tell himself it would pass. He slid down the wall and sat on the cold concrete and was halfway convinced he was dying. Kale had found him. He did not call anyone. He did not run for help. He sat down on the floor beside Ren, in his security jacket on cold concrete, in a stairwell that smelled like industrial cleaner, and said nothing at all. He just sat there, present and completely calm, until Ren's breathing slowed and his hands stopped shaking and the world came back into focus. When Ren finally looked at him, Kale said, "Better." Ren had nodded. "Okay," Kale said. Then he stood up, offered Ren a hand, and walked him back to the rehearsal room like nothing had happened. That was the beginning. It was slow. It was careful. It grew in the spaces between other things. Shared rides between schedules, late nights in practice rooms when everyone else had gone home, quiet conversations that lasted hours about things neither of them talked about with anyone else. Ren had been in relationships before, short and convenient and mostly performative, and none of them had felt like this. This felt like finding something he hadn't known he was looking for. Something that fit around the actual shape of who he was. Kale had taken even longer to admit it out loud. He was private in a way that went all the way down. He held things carefully, turned them over slowly, made sure before he moved. When he finally said it, they were sitting on a rooftop in late spring with cold convenience store food between them. And he said it simply, without preamble, looking straight ahead at the city. "I think I'm in love with you." Ren had not said anything for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "I've been in love with you for about a year and a half." Kale had turned to look at him. The expression on his face was so rare, genuinely startled, genuinely open, that Ren had started laughing, and then Kale had exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a very long time. That had been the beginning of the real thing. They were careful, always. The industry did not reward complicated. Ren's career was still finding its footing, and Kale's position depended on professional conduct. And there were no protections in place for what they were, so they kept it close and small and theirs. No public moments. No visible familiarity on job sites. An agreement, unspoken but solid, that the work came first and the private life stayed private. It had not always been easy. There were nights of distance and weeks of silence when schedules made everything impossible. There were moments of almost discovered, when a staff member looked too long or a camera angled wrong, that sent Ren's heart into his throat. There were arguments, real ones, about what they were allowed to want and what had to be given up for the sake of other things. But there was also this. The mornings, the coffee smell, the worn gray shirt, the man at the window who always knew when Ren was awake before Ren said anything. 7 years of this. That morning, Kale walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. He tilted his head and studied Ren the way he always did when he was trying to decide something. Slow and thorough, like reading something he wanted to understand completely before putting it down. "There's a meeting today," he said. Ren felt the morning shift slightly. "What kind of meeting?" "Your new management team." A pause. "And some people from the label side." Ren had known this meeting was coming. He had been trying not to think about it for 2 weeks. The company had just merged into a larger label group, one of the biggest in the country, and with the merger came a new management structure and a very clear message that existing artist contracts were being reviewed for alignment. In the industry, reviewed for alignment meant changed, in ways the artist probably wouldn't be consulted about. "Ms. Park will be there," Kale added. Ren made a face. He had met Ms. Park twice before. She was sharp and elegant and completely indifferent to things that did not serve her immediate purpose. "I'll figure it out," Ren said, with the deliberate lightness he used when he had not figured anything out yet. Kale looked at him for one more moment. Then he stood up. "Coffee's ready. Don't be dramatic about the ginger." "I'm never dramatic." Kale gave him a very specific look and walked back to the kitchen. Later that afternoon, Ren sat across from 3 managers and 2 label-side directors in a glass conference room on the 14th floor of a building that smelled like expensive air freshener and quiet power. The table was long and clean. The view through the window was impressive. Everything in the room was designed to communicate that the people on the other side of the table had already made their decisions and were now presenting them as conversations. Ms. Park sat in the center. She wore a charcoal blazer and had her hair pinned back with precise elegance. She smiled at Ren when he sat down. The smile was professional and completely opaque. They talked about the new contract for 40 minutes. Bigger budget, better distribution, international reach that Ren's current deal did not have. The numbers were real and they were good, and Ren listened to every one of them with the part of his brain that had been calculating career moves since he was 19. Then Miss Park folded her hands on the table and the register of the conversation changed. "We want to talk about your team," she said. "Specifically regarding your personal security arrangements." Ren kept his face very still. "All right. We feel that the current configuration is," she paused, selecting the word with visible care, "too close in terms of the personal dynamic for a professional arrangement of this nature." "I see." We understand that certain relationships develop naturally over long periods of shared work, she continued. We're not suggesting any wrongdoing. But for the image we're building with this campaign, clarity of professional boundaries is important. She looked at him evenly. Visible personal familiarity between an artist and their security creates an impression that we feel is counterproductive to the brand. The brand. The word sat in Ren's chest like something cold. We'd like to suggest a reassignment, she said. The individual in question would remain with the company in a high-quality role. There would be no negative impact on their record or standing. She smiled again. We simply want cleaner lines. Ren looked at the contract on the table in front of him. The numbers were still there. The career path was still there. Ms. Park was still smiling. I understand, Ren said. His voice came out even and professional, which was a small miracle. I'll need a few days to review. Of course. She pushed the contract an inch closer to him. Take the time you need. When Ren got home that evening, the apartment smelled like ginger soup. The table was set. There was a small candle in the center of it that Kale had definitely lit as a joke. He always lit candles sarcastically, claiming they were unnecessarily theatrical. But he also bought them himself, which was a contradiction he never explained. Kale was in the kitchen with his back to the door, stirring something. He glanced over his shoulder when Ren came in. He took one look at Ren's face and turned back to the stove without a word. Ren stood at the door for a long moment. He watched Kale move around the kitchen, opening a cabinet to get bowls, ladling soup with calm precision, carrying both bowls to the table with the same unhurried care he brought to every physical task. He looked like himself. He looked like home. Ren thought about Ms. Park's folded hands. He thought about the word reassignment. He thought about 7 years and a cold stairwell floor. Then he walked inside and sat down. Good meeting, Kale asked, setting a bowl in front of him. Ren picked up his spoon. We'll talk later. Kale sat down across from him. He looked at Ren for one long, careful moment. Then he picked up his own spoon. Okay, he said. They ate dinner. They talked about small things, a film one of the staff members had recommended, a ridiculous thing that had happened in the practice room that afternoon, whether or not the candle smelled like something or nothing. The conversation was easy and warm and entirely ordinary, and Ren laughed twice at real things and meant it both times. He did not bring up the meeting. That night, after Kale was asleep and the apartment was dark and quiet, Ren sat at the kitchen table with the contract laid out flat in front of him. He read it again. All of it. Every clause, every footnote, every carefully constructed sentence. He thought about what he wanted. He thought about what it would cost. He told himself the things people tell themselves when they already know what they're going to do but haven't accepted it yet. He sat with the pen in his hand for a long time. Then he signed it. He folded the contract, put it in his bag, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the dark apartment for a moment before he went back to bed. Outside, the city hummed its ordinary late-night sounds. The candle had burned down to nothing. The morning after Ren signed the contract, he woke up before Kale for the first time in years. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of what he had done sitting on his chest like a physical thing. Not regret exactly, he didn't know what to call it yet. Just the specific heaviness of a decision that cannot be unsigned, sitting in your body before you have found the words to explain it to anyone else. He got up quietly. He made coffee. He stood at the window the way Kale usually did and looked at the city below and tried to think clearly, tried to find the framing that would make this okay, the version of the story where everything worked out fine. The thing was, the numbers were real. The new label's reach was real. This was the opportunity Ren had been working toward since he was 19 years old in a mid-tier company, anxious and too loud, performing at showcases that barely filled half their seats. He had worked for this. He had earned it. He was allowed to want it. And Kale would understand. Kale always understood the parts of the career that were difficult. He had never asked Ren to choose. He had never made the love into a demand or a condition or a pressure point. Ren told himself this was manageable, that the reassignment on paper didn't have to mean anything real, that they were adults who had been navigating complicated circumstances for 7 years and they could navigate this too. He told himself this right until Kale walked out of the bedroom, looked at him standing at the window and said, "You signed it." It wasn't a question. Ren turned around. You signed it," Kale said again. Not angry, not loud, just reading the situation with the precision he applied to everything. "When?" "Last night." A silence. Kale walked to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup. He stood with his back to Ren for a moment, and Ren watched that back and tried to read the set of his shoulders, the slight stillness of his posture. "Did they put the reassignment clause in writing?" Kale asked, still facing the coffee maker. "Yes. And you signed it." "Kale." Kale finally turned around. His face was composed in the way it got when he was keeping something very controlled. Not blank, never blank. Ren had learned to read the differences but held. Carefully held. "Okay," he said. "That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say?" He came to the table and sat down. He looked at Ren across the kitchen. "You made your decision. I'm not going to." He stopped. "I'm not going to make this harder for you. It's not just my decision. It affects you. I know that." Something moved in Kale's expression. "Which is why I'm not yelling." The days that followed were loud in every way that made them easy to not think. Ren's schedule expanded immediately. The new label moved fast, and suddenly his days were stacked from 6 in the morning to well past midnight. Recording sessions in back-to-back blocks. Choreography rehearsals for the comeback stage that left his whole body aching. Press preparation with a new PR team who had very specific ideas about how Ren should present himself and very little patience for spontaneity. Costume fittings, concept photo discussions, media training sessions with a woman who kept saying the words "controlled narrative" in a tone that made them sound like a prayer. Ren threw himself into all of it. Busyness was a solution he had used before. It was not a good solution, but it was a functional one. If every hour of the day had a demand attached to it, there was no room for the thing he hadn't figured out how to talk about yet. But Kale noticed. He always noticed. One evening, 10 days after the contract was signed, Kale met Ron at the door when he came home from a late recording session. He was standing in the hallway with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been waiting with patience and had run out of it. "You're avoiding something," he said. "I'm tired," Ron said, moving past him to drop his bag. "You've been tired every time I try to talk to you for 10 days.
I'm genuinely tired.
The schedule is
Rain.
Ren stopped. He turned around. Kale was looking at him with that steady, patient attention, and Ren felt the exhaustion and the guilt and the weeks of unspoken things pushing against the inside of his chest all at once. "I'll tell you tonight," he said. "I promise. I'll actually tell you tonight." Kale looked at him for a moment. "You've said that before." "I know, but I mean it this time. Tonight." Kale stepped aside. Ren walked past. They ate dinner in a conversation that was warm enough on the surface and carefully, mutually contained underneath, and afterward Kale washed the dishes while Ren sat at the table and tried to find the right words and kept not finding them. Eventually Kale came and sat across from him, dried his hands and waited. Ren told him. He told him about the meeting, about Ms. Park and the folded hands, about the reassignment clause and the clean professional lines they wanted to draw. He explained it carefully, objectively, using the language that made it sound like a business decision because that was the distance he needed to get through it without his voice breaking. Kale listened to the whole thing without interrupting. His face stayed composed. His hands were still on the table. He was the calmest person in the room by a significant distance, which made Ren feel worse, not better. When Ren finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "On record," Kale said. "Yes. They want visible distance. Documented distance. That's what the clause covers, yes." Another silence. Kale looked at the table. Something moved behind his eyes. Something old and careful. Something that Ren recognized as the version of Kale who had sat on a cold stairwell floor and said almost nothing, because sometimes words made things harder instead of easier. "When does it take effect?" Kale asked. "The new team takes over officially in 3 weeks." Kale nodded. "I'm not saying nothing has to change between us," Ren said, too fast, filling the silence with something. "We figure it out. We figured out hard things before. We."
Reihen.
Kale's voice was very quiet. I know. Then why do you look like that? Kale looked up. The expression on his face was doing something complicated. Something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief and was somehow both of those things at once. Because you signed it without talking to me. Not because you signed it. He paused. You made a decision that affects both of us and you signed the paper and then you came home and you had dinner with me and you didn't say anything for 10 days. The truth of that landed cleanly. Ren did not try to argue it. I'm sorry, he said. Kale looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking at the city, and Ren watched him and felt the distance between them, 2 feet of kitchen floor, as the most significant space he had ever stood across. I'll be at the HR meeting on Monday, Kale said finally, for the reassignment paperwork. You don't have to do it right away. We can. It's better to do it right away, Kale said, still facing the window. Drawn-out things are harder. Ren stared at the back of his head. He wanted to say, don't go. He wanted to say, I made a mistake. I'll fix it. Let me fix it. He wanted to say the actual truth, that he had signed because he was scared, because wanting the career and wanting Kale at the same time had felt like too much to carry, and he had chosen the one that came with a pen and a deadline and a room full of people waiting. Instead he said, I love you. Kale didn't move for a moment. Then he said, I know. I love you too. He finally turned around, and his face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Go to bed. You have a 6 o'clock call. He walked past Ren to the bedroom. The door closed behind him. Quietly, carefully, with the exact amount of force needed and not one bit more. Ren sat alone at the kitchen table. Outside, the city went on doing what it always did, indifferent and steady and not remotely interested in the grief of 2 people in a well-lit kitchen. He sat there until he was too tired to sit anymore. Then he went to bed. 3 months later, Ren's name was on the cover of 4 magazines in the same week. It was the kind of thing that should have felt like everything. He had been chasing this, the covers, the chart positions, the kind of professional recognition that made a career solid instead of just present, for most of his adult life. The comeback single had debuted at number 2 and climbed to number 1 by the 3rd week. Streaming numbers broke personal records. His name was in conversations he had never been in before, trending across platforms, discussed in the kind of industry spaces where decisions about the next 5 years of an artist's career got made quietly over dinner. His management team was delighted. Ms. Park sent a formal congratulations message through a junior assistant that was professionally warm in a way that contained zero actual warmth. Ren read one of the magazine profiles in the back of a company car while Kale sat in the front passenger seat. Bodyguard. That was the word on all the official scheduling documents now. Not companion. Not personal staff, not close contact security, not any of the careful euphemisms that had previously described Kale's role on Ren's team. Just the single clean word, bodyguard. It looked smaller than everything it contained. In public, the distance was exactly what Ms. Park had wanted, clean and visible and professionally impeccable. Kale walked 2 steps behind and 1 step right. He spoke to Ren in short, contained sentences. Vehicle is ready. Schedule update in 20 minutes. Please stay to the left of the group at this venue. He wore his earpiece and his dark jacket and the same steady expression that had always been his professional face, except now that face was on all the time, in every context, with no version underneath it that Ren was allowed to reach. At fan events, Kale stood at a measured distance and scanned the room. At press interviews, he waited in the corridor. At after-event dinners with label staff, he sat at the adjacent table and did not join the conversation. He was professional. He was exactly what the label wanted. Ren had never hated the word professional so much. In private, there was no more private. This was the detail Ren had failed to fully consider when he signed the contract. The label's professional clarity clause was broader than it looked. No off-record personal contact between the artist and designated security personnel. No personal communication on non-work channels. No visible personal familiarity in any context, including private facilities, including after hours. And this had been communicated in a separate conversation with a junior manager who had clearly drawn the short straw for that particular duty. Members of Ren's team had been made aware of the expectations, which meant people were watching, not aggressively, not with cameras, just in the way that people who want to keep their jobs watch things when they've been told that watching matters. The apartment was its own strange situation. The label had preferred that Ren and Kale not share a residence, but relocation had not been explicitly required by the contract, and since no one had pressed it directly, no one had moved out. They still lived in the same apartment. They still shared a kitchen and 2 bathrooms and a morning coffee routine. But they moved through the shared space with the careful, contained choreography of 2 people following an agreement that no one had written down but both of them understood. They did not touch. They did not sit close. They did not have the late-night conversations that had been the foundation of the last 7 years. They slept in their respective rooms, which they had always technically done. They had always been careful, always maintained the physical habits of 2 people who were officially just colleagues sharing an address. Except before, those habits were a cover over something warm and real. Now the habits were just the habits. Ren started writing songs faster than he had in years. Dark ones, mostly, the kind he didn't show the management team, the kind that lived in the private folder on his laptop labeled "Not for Label Eyes." Songs about standing in a room full of people and feeling like no one could see the most important thing about him. Songs about loneliness that wore a happy face all day and came home exhausted. Songs that were too specific to be deniable if anyone read them carefully. He wrote one at 3 in the morning about the sound of a door closing with exactly the right amount of force. On a Tuesday in the 3rd month, Run was doing a fan sign event at a large mall in the city center. The line was enormous. Hundreds of fans stretching out of sight, each one holding an album, each face bright with the particular excitement of someone about to have a personal moment with someone they admired from a distance. Ren loved this part of his work. He genuinely did. There was nothing performed about the warmth he felt meeting his fans, the stories they told him, the things they made and brought to show him, the transparent joy of people who cared deeply about something that he had made. He signed and smiled and talked and listened, working through the line with full attention, and he was not performing. He meant every bit of it. And then a young woman with a camera strap and kind eyes leaned forward over the signing table and said, very quietly, "Are you okay? You look a little tired." Ren's hand paused on the album. He looked at her. She looked back with genuine, uncomplicated concern, the kind of concern that had no agenda, that wasn't looking for a story or a reaction, that was just a person noticing something and saying it out loud. For 1 second, Ren wanted to give her the real answer. Instead, he adjusted his smile and said, "Just a busy month. Thank you for asking." She nodded and moved on. Ren looked down at the album he had just signed. His own face looked back at him from the cover. Styled and lit and composed, everything calibrated to project exactly the right impression. He picked up his pen and kept going. Kale was 10 feet away, facing outward, hands clasped in the neutral ready position he always held at events. Run let himself look at Kale's back for exactly 2 seconds. The straight line of his shoulders, the particular way he stood with his weight slightly forward, ready to move. Then he looked back at the next fan in line. That evening, in the van, Kale sat in front. The team talked quietly among themselves about the next day's schedule. The city passed outside the windows, all lit up glass and ordinary evening movement. Ren's phone buzzed. Unknown number. "I heard about the reassignment. If it gets too hard, there's a workaround. I know people." Ren frowned at the screen. Before he could decide whether to ignore it, a second message arrived. "This is Song Jaiwin. From the old training days. I think you still remember me." Ren went very still. He did remember. Song Jaiwin. Former backup dancer. Former trainee at the same company where Ren had started. One of only 3 people who had known, without being told, just from watching too carefully, about Run and Kale back in the early days when they had not yet learned to be as careful as they later became. Song had left the company several years ago under circumstances that were discussed in brief whispers and then not discussed at all, which was the industry's way of marking something as finished and private. Ren stared at the messages. Up front, Kale turned his head briefly to check the traffic on the right side. His profile was clean and still in the evening light. Ren locked his phone. He looked out the window. Whatever Song Jaiwin wanted, it was going to be complicated. He was suddenly very certain of that. The cafe Song had named was small and unremarkable and exactly the kind of place that people chose when they wanted to have a conversation without being recognized. It sat on a side street near the edge of the entertainment district, the kind of neighborhood that had once been fashionable and had settled into something quieter and more permanent. All small businesses and old buildings and morning light that came in sideways through narrow windows. Song was already there when Rin arrived. He was sitting at a corner table with a black coffee in front of him and the easy, unhurried posture of someone who had made peace with waiting. He looked almost the same as Ren remembered, a little sharper in the face, a little more certain in how he held himself, better clothes. The nervous trainee energy was gone, replaced by something settled and self-possessed. He smiled when Ren sat down. "You still walk like you're late for something." "I'm always late for something." Ren dropped his bag onto the chair beside him and leaned forward immediately. "What did you mean by work around?" "Good morning to you too." Song waved down the server. "Coffee?" "Song, let me order first." "I'm not going anywhere." Ren sat back with visible effort. He watched Song order 2 coffees with the calm of a man who had nothing pressing on his schedule, and he reminded himself that pushing was not going to get him information faster. He waited while the server left. "How did you get my number?" Ren asked. "I know people." Song tilted his head. "I've known people this whole time, Ren. I just hadn't had reason to use the connection until now. And now you do. I thought you might need to know some things." Song looked at him steadily across the table. "I heard about the contract, the reassignment clause, the new labels management approach." He paused. "People talk in this industry, even people who've left it." "What people?" "People who've been through the same thing." Song's expression shifted into something more direct. "That label has done this before. Not with you specifically, before you. They have a pattern with certain artists. They identify something about you that's complicated, something personal, something they're not supposed to know about, and they use it to structure your contract in a way that gives them control." Ren felt something move in his chest. "What do you mean, control?" "I mean leverage," Song said simply. "The wall between you and Kale isn't about your image. It's not about public perception or brand clarity or any of the things MS. Park said in that meeting. He met Ren's eyes. "They know about you and Kale. They've known for a while. The distance they're enforcing is a mechanism. It means that as long as they hold the documentation about your relationship, and as long as Kale's employment depends on staying in the company's favor, you will work harder, behave better, and cause fewer problems. Because the risk is not just to you. The risk is to him." The cafe was warm and full of quiet morning sounds. Someone at a nearby table was having a phone call in a low voice. The coffee machine behind the counter hissed briefly. Ren looked at the table. "They showed you this in the contract?" Song asked. "It wasn't in those words. It never is. It's in the structure, the specific language used, the clauses that seem reasonable individually but function as a system together." Song picked up his coffee. "I know, because I had a version of the same contract 3 years ago." Ren looked up. "I was 23, Song said. "I had been at the company for 2 years and I had my own complicated situation. Nothing like yours, different shape, different person, but the same type of private thing that companies decide to know about." He said it easily, without drama. "They offered me terms. Terms that were structured to keep me manageable. And I took them because I was young and scared and didn't understand what I was signing." He paused. "I regret that. Not the decision exactly, I understand now why I made it. But the not understanding. I wish someone had told me." "So you're telling me," Rin said. "I'm telling you early," Song corrected. "So you still have room to move." A silence settled between them. Rin turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You said there were things happening," Rin said slowly. "Things I don't know about." He looked at Song carefully. "About Kale." Song's expression shifted. Just slightly, not a big shift, but enough. "There was a meeting," Rin said, 2 weeks ago. One that wasn't on either of our official schedules." He watched Song's face. "How do you know about it? Who told you?" Song set his cup down. He laced his fingers together on the table and looked at Run with something that was both honesty and caution. Someone reached out to me. Someone who had also been approached. He paused. I want to be clear, the person who reached out to me is someone I trust. They were in a difficult position and they handled it the best way they could. He met Ren's eyes. You need to ask Kale about that meeting. Not from me. From him. What was the meeting about? Kale should tell you. Not because I'm protecting the label. I'm not. But because the conversation needs to happen between the two of you, and if I give you pieces of it, you'll walk into it with assumptions that could make it harder. Song looked at him steadily. Ask him. Tonight. Don't give him an out. Ren stared at him. I'm not saying he did anything wrong, Song said. I want to be very clear about that. I'm saying that there are things in motion that you don't have the full picture of, and you need the full picture before someone else decides to show it to you in a less favorable way. The morning light shifted through the narrow cafe window. Ren sat with that for a moment. Then he said, the workaround you mentioned. In your first message. Song nodded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A single page handwritten in 2 columns. Contact. A contract lawyer who has handled 2 cases with the same label structure. Some documentation I've been putting together about the pattern of how this label operates. He slid it across the table. If you want to fight it, legally, on your own terms. Ren picked up the paper. You don't have to decide right now, Song said. You don't even have to believe me right now. Just, he looked at him. Talk to Kale. And keep that paper somewhere safe. Ren folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. Outside, a black company car was pulling up to the curb. His scheduled pickup, arriving precisely on time. Through the cafe window, before the car fully stopped, Ren could see the familiar outline of Kale in the front passenger seat. Head turning toward the cafe, already knowing exactly which table Run was sitting at. He always knew. Ren stood up. He picked up his bag. Thank you, he said to Song. Song looked at him with something that was almost fond. Be careful, he said. Both of you. Run walked out of the cafe into the cold morning. Kale got out of the car when he saw him coming, professional and composed and precisely 2 steps away, and said, Schedule starts in 35 minutes. The venue is 20 minutes out. Okay, Ren said. He got in the car. He looked at the back of Kale's head as they pulled into traffic. He felt the paper folded in his pocket. He thought about a meeting 2 weeks ago and things you don't know and ask him tonight. He thought about 7 years. He was going to ask. Run did not ask Kale directly. This was a deliberate choice. He had learned over 7 years of loving someone who processed things from the inside out that direct questions, asked without the right space and the right moment, tended to get answers that were technically truthful and emotionally incomplete. Kale was not a liar. He was a person who moved carefully, who believed that some things needed to be understood fully before being handed over, who gave people only what he was sure of and kept the uncertain things close until they were certain. It was one of the qualities that Ren loved about him and one of the qualities that sometimes drove him completely out of his mind. So instead of asking, Ren watched. He paid attention the way Kale had taught him, not suspiciously, not searching for confirmation of something already decided, but with genuine open attention, the kind that just collects information without immediately interpreting it. He noticed that Kale was sometimes gone for 30-minute stretches during the evenings that couldn't be accounted for by his official schedule. He noticed that Kale had a second phone, small and dark, different from his standard work issue and his personal phone, kept in the inner pocket of his jacket and never left on any surface. He noticed that twice in the same week, Kale was already awake and sitting at the kitchen table when Ren's alarm went off at 5 in the morning. Not with coffee, just sitting, in the dark, with something Ren couldn't name on his face. On a Thursday, 2 weeks after meeting Song, Ren arrived early to a press event building. His schedule had shifted forward by an hour due to a cancellation elsewhere in the day, and the update had not reached the full team in time. He walked into the ground floor lobby and immediately heard Kale's voice coming from a corridor to the left. Low, private, the tone he used when he thought no one else was near. Ren stopped. He stood at the corridor entrance, pressed to the wall and listened. It's getting harder to manage from this end, Kale said. He's starting to notice things. The timeline is going to have to move. A pause. I know what I agreed to. I'm telling you the situation on the ground is different than it looked 3 months ago. Another pause, longer this time, while whoever was on the other end spoke. The information is still secure. I haven't moved on it yet. I need more time before this goes anywhere. A shorter pause. Don't contact me here again. I'll reach out when it's ready. The call ended. Run pressed his back against the wall and stared at the lobby ceiling and breathed. He processed the words slowly. He was good at this, at holding information without immediately reacting, at turning things over carefully before drawing conclusions. It was something he had learned from watching Kale do it, and the irony of using it now was not lost on him. Starting to notice things. The information is still secure. I need more time. The words rearranged themselves in his mind, looking for a shape that made sense. He walked back to the elevator. He pressed the button. He rode up to the event floor and greeted the press team with a warm, practiced smile and sat through 2 back-to-back interviews about his comeback and his creative process and how it felt to finally be where he was in his career. He answered every question. He smiled in all the right places. He was very, very good at his job. Kale appeared beside him 20 minutes into the event. Professional, composed, 2 steps back and 1 step right. He said, "Next interview in 15? And nothing else," and Ren said, "Thank you," in the professional tone and looked back at the interviewer. After the event, in the van, Ren pulled out his phone and opened a new message thread to Song. "I need the documents. All of them. As soon as possible." Song replied within the minute. "How much do you know?" "Enough to need the rest. Sending tonight. Are you okay?" Ren looked at the back of Kale's head in the front seat. The particular way his neck looked under the earpiece. The familiar line of his shoulders in the dark jacket. "I don't know yet," Ren typed back. He put his phone away. That evening, Song sent a compressed file containing 52 documents. Contracts, internal memos, communication logs, HR records with personal information redacted, a set of recorded meeting notes from a division of the label that Ren had never heard of. Ren sat with his laptop at the kitchen table from 9 in the evening to past 1 in the morning. He took breaks twice, once to make tea, once to walk around the apartment 3 times because he needed to be upright. The documents were complicated. Some were dense legal language that required multiple readings. Some were straightforward, but their implications were not. By the time he closed the laptop, he had a picture. Not a complete picture, but enough of one to understand the shape of what had been happening around him for the past 3 months. The label had investigated Ren and Kale before the contract was offered. Not invasively, they hadn't needed to. 7 years of close contact between an artist and their personal staff, no public girlfriend or boyfriend for either of them, certain patterns of behavior that careful people noticed. The label had built a confidential file. When the new contract was structured, the file became part of the architecture. Enforce distance on paper. Keep both of them in a state of managed uncertainty. The threat didn't need to be spoken, it just needed to exist. And 3 months ago, someone from a compliance division had approached Kale. The documents were less clear on the specifics of what was offered, but they made the outlines plain. Cooperation in exchange for security. Gather information about the label's exposure points, which artists were likely to cause problems, which situations were at risk of going public, which internal practices were vulnerable. In exchange, Kale's position would be guaranteed regardless of what happened with Ren's contract. It was an offer designed to put Kale in a box. Say yes, become an informant for the people controlling you. Say no, and the documentation about your relationship with Ren becomes a liability. Ren stared at the wall of the dark kitchen for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked to Kale's bedroom door. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before he touched it. Kale was standing there in a gray t-shirt and loose trousers, looking like someone who hadn't slept in several nights. He looked at Ren. His face was doing something rare and complicated and completely unguarded in the way that it only got when he had already decided to stop holding something. "I was going to come to you tonight," Kale said quietly. "I know," Ren said. Kale stepped back. Ren walked inside. They sat down on the floor, old habit, floor conversations for big things, the way they had always done it. Leaning against the side of the bed, shoulders not quite touching, in the dark apartment with the city outside the window. "Tell me everything," Rin said. Kale told him. The story Kale told took most of the night. He started at the beginning, the actual beginning, not the beginning Rin already knew. He started 3 months ago, 8 days after the new contract had been signed and the professional reassignment had taken effect, when a man named Director O had appeared in a corridor and asked if they could find a quiet place to talk. Director O was not from Ren's management team. He sat several levels above that, in the compliance and governance division of the parent company, the kind of role that most artists and most staff never encountered directly because it operated in the invisible machinery of institutional decision-making. He was polite. He was complimentary. He talked about Kale's record with the company, his 7 years of dedicated service, the high regard in which people spoke of him. He spoke like someone who had done this before and knew exactly how to make it feel like a conversation rather than a proposal. Then he made his offer. The label had documentation. Kale already knew that. What Director O revealed was that the documentation was more extensive than Kale had understood. Not just patterns of behavior, but specific incidents, specific locations, specific timestamps going back 4 years. Someone had been building the file for a long time. Director O didn't dwell on this point. He just laid it out plainly, the way you place something heavy on a table to let its weight speak for itself. The offer had 2 parts. First, Kale would provide information about Ren's team and schedule, specifically flagging any situations where Ren might be approaching contact with journalists, lawyers, or other industry figures outside his official management structure. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet heads-up when things were moving in directions the label didn't know about. Second, in exchange, Kale's employment, his professional reputation, and the confidentiality of the existing documentation would all be protected indefinitely. If Kale refused, Director O said, with his polite smile, the situation would become more complicated for everyone. Kale had not said yes. He had also not said no. He had asked for time to consider, which Director O had agreed to readily, and then he had spent the next 3 months thinking and watching and quietly gathering information of his own. Because Kale was, at his core, a person who gathered information before acting, who understood that knowing more than the other party was the only real advantage in a situation where every other advantage had been removed. He had found Song Jaiwin through a contact at the company, a logistics staff member who had worked with Song before he left and had stayed in loose touch. Song had been approached by the same division 2 years ago with a similar offer, which he had refused, which had been part of why his departure from the company had been managed so quietly and with a non-disclosure attached. Song and Kale had been in contact for 6 weeks. Slowly, carefully, building documentation, looking for the regulation angle that Song's lawyer contact, Attorney No, had identified as the potential crack in the label's foundation. Throughout all of this, Kale had told Rin none of it. When he reached this part of the story, he stopped. "I was going to fix it," he said quietly. I thought if I could bring you a solution instead of a problem, it would be different. It would be less weight on you." Ren had been listening without moving. He listened to the end and then he sat with everything for a while, turning it over, feeling the shape of it. "You were trying to protect me," he said finally. "Yes, by carrying everything alone." Kale's jaw moved slightly. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like something I did," Ren said. "When I signed the contract without telling you." He looked at his hands. "We both decided to protect each other without asking if that's what the other person wanted." A silence that was different from the silences that had filled the apartment for 3 months. This one breathed. "I was scared," Kale said. Ren turned his head. Kale was looking at the floor. His voice was level, but the thing underneath it was not. "I was scared that if you knew, if I brought you the full situation, you'd try to fight it and it would cost you the career. Or," he stopped. He tried again. "Or you'd decide the easiest resolution was to let the label win. To make it cleaner. And I couldn't." His voice went carefully flat. "I couldn't watch you choose that again." The words landed exactly as heavy as they were. Run stared at the floor beside Kale's hand. He felt the truth in it, the fair part and the unfair part together, the love in it and the fear in it, all of it at once. "I chose the contract because I was afraid you'd tell me not to," Ren said slowly. And I didn't want to risk hearing that. So I made the decision alone and told myself it was for both of us. He looked up. We're both idiots. Kale exhaled. Yes, we are genuinely, significantly idiotic people who love each other. Yes, Kale said again. The corner of his mouth moved. Run reached over and put his hand over Kale's on the floor. Kale's hand turned over immediately and held on, and something in the room shifted. Not resolution, nothing as complete as that, but the first real warmth between them in 3 months that wasn't managed or careful or held behind professional glass. They sat on the floor for another hour, going through everything. Song's documents, attorney knows analysis, the regulation that the label had not accounted for, the specific clauses in Ren's contract that had crossed into illegal territory, the approach, the timeline, the risks involved. The label had built a cage. Cages, Run had been told once by a songwriter he admired, are only as strong as their lock. If this goes wrong, Kale said, your contract could be. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong together, Run said. I'm not leaving you to handle the fallout of a decision we made together. Kale looked at him for a long time. Okay, he said. Okay. Ren searched his face. Kale tightened his grip on Ren's hand. Okay. His voice was steady. Together. Ren let out a breath he had been holding for 3 months. Everything moved quickly once it started. Attorney No was exactly as sharp as Song had described. She was young, maybe 30, with a precise, efficient way of speaking that wasted nothing and implied a great deal. She met with Run and Kale together in a borrowed conference room and laid out the case in clean, logical terms, pointing to specific clauses in Ren's contract and setting them alongside specific articles in the new legislation with the calm satisfaction of someone who had already done this twice and knew where the edges were. The key legal point was this. The regulation, passed 18 months ago, prohibited entertainment companies from using undisclosed personal information about an artist to structure contract terms. Specifically, it covered situations where a company had gathered information about an artist's private life, through internal investigation, surveillance, or staff reporting, and then used that information to include terms that the artist could not have knowingly agreed to, because the basis for those terms was never disclosed. The label had done exactly that. They had gathered documentation about Ren and Kale. They had used that documentation to design the reassignment clause. They had never told Ren that this clause was based on information they had gathered about his private relationship. They had presented it as a standard image management decision. They built the contract on a foundation they didn't disclose, Attorney No said. That makes the clause invalid under the new regulation. And because the clause is invalid, certain other provisions that flow from it are also contestable. Ren looked at the highlighted pages spread across the table. How solid is this? Solid enough to file, she said. Solid enough that when they see the filing, their legal team will understand immediately that they have a problem. She paused. I won't tell you it's guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. But they took a shortcut when they wrote this contract, because they assumed no one would know where to look. Song, sitting in the corner of the room with his arms crossed, said, they make that assumption a lot. The complaint was filed privately, through the regulatory channel on a Friday morning. Not public, this was not a press strategy. It was a legal mechanism, quiet and precise, designed to force a conversation that the label had not planned on having. By the following Monday, the label's response was already in motion. Director O requested a meeting with Kale. Kale declined, in writing, through Attorney No. The refusal was formal and professional and contained, between its lines, the clear message that the Compliance Division was no longer an unknown threat. An attempt was made to schedule a press strategy session about Ren's public image going forward. Ren's team canceled it. And Song's careful, patient work, an independent entertainment journalist was asking questions about internal contract practices at the label. Nothing published yet, just questions. The kind that meant the window for a quiet resolution was narrowing. Within the label, things were shifting in ways that Ren could feel but not fully see. Ms. Park's assistant sent 2 messages that were warmer and less structured than her usual communications. A senior manager Ren had never spoken with directly reached out through his publicist to express enthusiasm about the January single. The temperature of the company's relationship with him was changing. They were recalculating. Ren went on with his public schedule through all of it, because stopping would have been visible and visibility was a tool he wasn't ready to use yet. He did a music show performance that ran 2 days of rehearsal and landed perfectly. He had worked on the stage design himself with the choreography team, and the result was exactly the kind of moment that his fans saved and rewatched and talked about. He did 2 radio interviews where he was genuinely funny and warm, where the conversations went places the hosts hadn't planned, where he was recognizably, completely himself. Between schedules, in the car, Kale sat beside him now. No one had said they couldn't. The official bodyguard designation was still technically in effect, but the enforcement of physical distance had loosened in the atmosphere of the complaint and the shifting calculation. Kale did not touch him in the car. Not on camera, not with anyone watching, but he sat beside him, and that was enough for now. That was more than enough. One morning, waiting for a recording session to start, they sat in a small room off the main studio while the sound engineers set something up. It was just the 2 of them. The room was quiet. Kale said, "Are you scared?" Ren thought about it honestly. "Not the way I expected to be." He looked at the wall. "I thought I would be. I've been scared of losing the career for most of my adult life. And now the thing that could actually threaten it is happening, and I feel..." He paused. "I feel clear. Like everything that was blurry before got focused." Kale looked at him. "I think I was afraid of the wrong things," Ren said. For a long time. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have trusted you with this from the beginning." "Yes. I still thought," he stopped. "Habit. Of managing things." "I know." Ren looked at him. "You can stop managing things on your own. I'm a full participant in my own life." Kale's expression did something small and quiet that was his version of a smile that hurt a little. "I know," he said. The negotiation between Attorney No and the label's legal team lasted 4 days. The outcome arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in formal language that both parties had agreed to. The reassignment clause was struck entirely from the contract. The personal documentation the label had gathered would be returned to Rian under legal supervision and deleted from all company records. The compliance division's involvement in artist-staff relationship management would be subject to an independent review, which was the legal way of saying that Director O's particular project was over. Ren signed the revised contract in Attorney No's office with Song and Kale present. Song brought terrible coffee from a vending machine down the hall. Attorney No accepted a cup without complaint, which made Ren immediately trust her more. Afterward, when the others had stepped into the hallway, Ren sat alone in the office for a moment with the signed document in front of him. He read back through the changed parts. The clean, fair language. The absence of things that had previously been present. He breathed. Then he stood up and walked out into the hallway and found Kale leaning against the wall directly across from the door, waiting. Winter arrived without ceremony. Not dramatically, not the way Ren had written winters in his songs as turning points, as the season of before and after, as the emotional landscape where significant things happened. It arrived the way actual winters do. Cooler mornings, the smell of the city changing, the light becoming shorter and more precious in the way that made you pay more attention to what was still warm. Ren noticed it on a morning in early December when he woke up before his alarm and lay still for a long moment, just existing inside the quiet. He could hear Kale in the kitchen. Cabinet doors opened and closed with exactly the right amount of care. The specific sound of the coffee maker running. A spoon set down on the counter with that characteristic unhurried precision that was so uniquely Kale that Ren could have identified it in a recording among 100 other people's morning sounds. He lay there and just listened to it. 7 years ago, and then for 3 months of silence, and now again the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a person who meant everything moving through a shared space without apology. He got up. The apartment looked the same as it always had. Same furniture, same gray morning light through the same curtains. But it felt different in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Places feel different when the people inside them have stopped being careful around each other. When rooms have been relaxed into instead of moved through. When 2 coffee mugs are already out in the morning because the second person is expected and not just hoped for. Kale looked up when Ren came into the kitchen. He was wearing the soft gray sweater, the one Ren had bought him 2 winters ago that Kale had received with the expression he wore for things he was going to act unbothered by and then use constantly. The sweater was visibly softer than when it was new. It had been worn approximately every 4 days for 2 years. "There's soup," Kale said before Ren had spoken. "I literally just woke up. You have a long session today. You need actual food." He set a bowl on the counter. "Don't make a face." "I wasn't going to make a face." "Your face was already doing something." Ren sat at the table. He looked at the soup. It was the ginger soup, the one Kale made when he thought Ren needed something that would settle him, with the amount of ginger that was objectively too much and that Ren had never once complained about. "I love you," Ren said. Kale carried his own bowl to the table and sat across from him. "I know. That's all you have? I made you soup at 6:45 in the morning." Kale picked up his spoon. "Evaluate your priorities." Ren smiled into his bowl. "I maintain that this is a love language. It's a nutritional decision. It's both. Eat your soup." They ate. They talked about the day. Ren had a full recording session and a late call with his publicist about the January single release, and Kale had a meeting with attorney No about the revised employment contract that had been pending since November. Things were still in motion. The label was in a period of cautious cordiality that felt fragile in some places but was holding, and the larger questions about Kale's formal role in Ren's team were being resolved slowly, in the careful language of legal documentation. But they were being resolved. Attorney No had used the phrase functional restoration twice in their last meeting, which was the professional way of saying that what had been separated was being put back together, on terms that were fair and documented and not subject to the kind of quiet manipulation that had structured the previous arrangement. Kale's new contract would not say bodyguard. That was the only thing Ren had asked Attorney No to ensure, and she had looked at him across her desk with clear, precise eyes and said, "That's a reasonable request." After breakfast, while Ren was checking his morning messages, Kale took both bowls to the sink and washed them with the same unhurried care he brought to every small task. The sound of water running, the specific rhythm of it. Ren watched him over the top of his phone without meaning to. He thought about the young woman at the fan sign who had asked if he was okay. He thought about what it had cost to say just a busy month when the real answer was a year's worth of complicated. He thought about the 3 months of careful distance and the late night on a cold stairwell floor 14 years ago and the rooftop in late spring where Kale had said, "I think I'm in love with you," like he had been waiting to be sure about it for a long time. Kale dried his hands. He turned around. He looked at Ren sitting at the table. "You're staring," he said. "I'm allowed to stare," Ren said. "You're in my kitchen. I live here. Exactly my point." Kale crossed the kitchen and stood beside Ren's chair. He looked down at him for a moment with that expression, the one that had no performance in it, that existed only in private rooms, completely open and completely steady. Then he reached out and pressed one hand lightly against the back of Ren's neck. Not holding, just resting, warm and present and exactly there. Ren went still. "Hey," Kale said quietly. Ren looked up. "I love you too," Kale said, like it was the simplest fact of the morning. Like it was as unremarkable and as essential as the soup on the stove and the 2 mugs already out and the gray sweater worn soft from 2 years of use. Ren reached up and covered Kale's hand with his own. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary winter things. Traffic sounds carrying differently in the cold air, light coming in at the low angle that December made. The pigeons on the window ledge had absolutely no opinions about contracts or legal proceedings or the slow, complicated process by which 2 people find their way back to each other after they have both chosen fear over honesty. Pigeons were good that way. Ren pulled Kale's hand forward until it rested against his cheek. He turned his head slightly. He said, into Kale's palm, "Don't let go." Kale's thumb moved, carefully, the way he did everything. "I wasn't planning to." They stayed like that for a moment, in the ordinary kitchen, in the ordinary morning light, in the apartment that had held 7 years of ordinary and complicated and wonderful and painful things. Outside, January was coming. The single was coming. The renegotiated contract, the restored team, the career that was still there and still real and still his. All of that was coming. But right now there was just this. Ren's phone buzzed with his morning alarm. He silenced it with his free hand without looking. Kale made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You have a... I know." Ren turned properly to face him. 5 more minutes. Kale looked at him for one long, unhurried moment. Then he pulled out the chair next to Ren, not across beside, and sat down. He kept one hand over Ren's on the table. He picked up his coffee with the other. 5 minutes, he agreed. They sat together at the table while the city moved outside the window and the morning became itself, and nothing was perfect and nothing needed to be perfect, and the mark that had been erased had come back. Not loudly, not dramatically, just in the way that real things come back when they were never really gone. Quietly, from the inside, in the space between two people who had finally, completely stopped being afraid.